The house was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. James sat in his worn-out armchair, his fingers tracing the edge of a framed photo resting on the side table. His wife's smile stared back at him. Frozen in time, untouched by the years that had passed since she left this world. He exhaled, a breath heavier than the winter wind outside. Loneliness had become a familiar presence, one he had stopped resisting long ago. Scratch. James frowned, his grip tightening on the armrest. Scratch. Scratch. The sound was faint but insistent, cutting through the dead air of his quiet home. His pulse quickened. He hadn't had visitors in years. His house, tucked away at the edge of town, rarely saw even the occasional lost traveler. He sat up straighter, his mind racing. Was it the wind? A stray cat? Something else? Then the scratching turned frantic, desperate, pleading. James's breath hitched. Someone, something, was out there. His feet felt heavy as he stood. He hesitated, staring at the door as uncertainty crept into his chest. Instinct told him to be cautious. He wasn't young anymore, and opening his door to the unknown was not a habit he entertained. Call someone? Ignore it? But something about the sound stirred something deep inside him. An ache he hadn't felt in years. His fingers hovered over the knob. Then, with a deep breath, he turned it. The door creaked open, and a sharp gust of icy wind whipped past him, making him shudder. But the cold wasn't what made his breath catch. A frail German shepherd stood on the threshold, her ribs pressing against her thin coat of tangled fur. Her golden brown eyes, wide, uncertain, locked onto his. She didn't bark, she didn't move, she simply stared, as if waiting for something. An answer, a sign, mercy. James's hand tightened around the doorknob. He swallowed hard. Where had she come from? And why did she look like she had nowhere left to go? James's first instinct was to shut the door. He didn't know this dog. She could be sick, aggressive. But then she wobbled. Her legs shook, barely holding her weight. The wind howled behind her, snow clinging to her matted fur. If he left her out there, she wouldn't last the night. His chest tightened. His logical mind screamed at him to let animal control handle it. But his heart, long dormant, cracked, but still beating, whispered a different answer. James exhaled sharply and stepped aside. The dog hesitated, her weary eyes scanning his face. Then, as if sensing his decision, she limped forward. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing out the cold. James stared at her trembling frame, unaware that in this moment he had not just saved her life, he had changed his own. The dog stood motionless, her frail body trembling under the weight of the cold. Snowflakes clung to her matted fur, melting into icy droplets against her thin frame. Her breath came in shallow, uneven puffs, visible in the freezing air. James hesitated, gripping the doorframe as he stared at her. The storm raged around them, wind howling like a restless ghost. Yet the dog didn't move. She simply stood there, staring at him with hollow, weary eyes, silent, unyielding, and waiting. James shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved. The world had its problems, and he had his own. But the sight of the dog, ribs pressing against her skin, legs barely holding her up, tugged at something buried deep inside him, something he had long ignored. With a resigned sigh, he turned back inside, rummaging through a closet until his fingers found an old wool blanket. Stepping outside again, he crouched down, wrapping the fabric carefully around the trembling creature. She flinched, muscles tensing, but she didn't resist. James hesitated again before gently lifting her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, too light. the warmth of his home wrapped around them like a barrier against the biting wind. The dog's body stiffened, eyes flickering with uncertainty as she took in her surroundings. For the first time in years, James felt another living soul in his home. The silence, once comforting, now felt different. Heavy, as if something unseen had shifted in the space between them. James set down a bowl of water and a plate with leftover meat. He barely had food for himself, but something told him this dog needed it more. The animal hesitated, glancing at James before lunging forward, devouring the meal with desperate hunger. The sound of her chewing filled the small kitchen, raw and primal. She licked the plate clean, then lifted her head, eyes searching his as if expecting more. James exhaled, rubbing his hands together. He hadn't planned on this. Yet, without thinking, he reached for another portion of food, something he never did for himself. As the dog settled near the fireplace, James crouched beside her and reached for her neck. His fingers brushed against damp fur. No collar, no tags. No one was looking for her. His jaw clenched. Has she been abandoned? Was she another casualty of someone else's carelessness? A familiar anger stirred inside him, the same bitterness that had kept him isolated for years. He wasn't sure why, but the thought of someone tossing her aside like trash made his stomach twist. He wasn't a rescuer, he wasn't a savior, but she was here now. Just as James leaned back, a distant howl sliced through the storm. The sound was eerie, long, drawn out, and too close for comfort. The dog's ears perked, body tensing like a coiled spring. Her head whipped toward the door, muscles rigid with something between fear and anticipation. James frowned, his skin prickling with unease. That wasn't just a stray dog's cry. It was something else, something searching, something calling. James swallowed, glancing between the dog and the door. His gut told him to stay out of it. He had done his part. The dog was inside, safe. That should have been enough. But the way she reacted, the way she flinched at the sound, unsettled him. Was she running from something? His hand hovered over the doorknob. Outside, the wind carried another distant howl. Inside, the dog curled up beside his chair, pressing against his leg. James exhaled. This wasn't just about a stray anymore. James exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he laid down an old blanket near the fireplace. Just for the night, he muttered, glancing at the dog. Shadow hesitated before cautiously stepping onto the blanket, his body tense, his amber eyes watching James warily. He curled up, keeping one eye open, muscles still coiled with uncertainty. James settled into his chair, unable to look away. The dog studied him, just as he studied the dog. It was strange. Two loners thrown together by chance, now trapped in this unspoken game of observation, neither ready to let down their guard. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the room. James turned a page in his book, but found himself distracted by Shadow's restless stillness. The dog barely slept. His ears twitched at every creak of the old house, every gust of wind rattling the windows. Every now and then their eyes met. James's gaze, curious yet hesitant. Shadow's, cautious but searching. Something stirred in James's chest, an ache he hadn't felt in years. He recognized that look, the quiet longing for safety, for belonging. Neither of them spoke, but in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them. Morning light filtered through the cabin's windows as James stood by the truck, staring at the stray curled in the passenger seat. "You better not bite," he grumbled, shutting the door and driving into town. The vet's office smelled of antiseptic and damp fur. Shadow tensed on the cold metal table, eyes darting toward James. "He's malnourished," the vet said. running a hand down the dog's ribs. No microchip, no collar. No one's looking for him. James swallowed as the vet straightened. You could take him to a shelter. James didn't answer. He knew what happened to dogs like Shadow in shelters. The thought unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. Back home, James filled a bowl with food and set it on the floor. Shadow hesitated before lowering his head, devouring the meal with desperate hunger. James sat in his chair, watching the dog eat, something twisting in his chest. Hunger like that wasn't just about food, it was about survival. Later that night, James read in silence. A faint rustling made him glance down. Shadow had moved closer, still keeping his distance but no longer pressed against the farthest wall. James didn't say a word, he simply let the moment settle between them. Shadow wasn't ready to be touched, but he wasn't afraid to be near. Days passed. James cooked breakfast, leaving an extra portion on the floor. He fixed his truck, glancing over his shoulder to find Shadow watching. He talked out loud, grumbling about the weather, muttering about repairs. He didn't expect a response, but Shadow listened. One evening, James caught it, a flicker of movement, a small, hesitant wag of a tail. Something softened in James's chest. The first time Shadow nudged his hand, James stiffened, fingers hovering in midair. Slowly, he reached out, fingertips grazing coarse fur. Shadow didn't pull away. The wall between them, silent and unspoken, began to crumble. James rubbed the back of his neck, watching as the dog moved in sync with him. Every step he took, Shadow followed. He fixed coffee. Shadow sat by the counter. He stepped into the garage. Shadow settled near the doorway. "You're like a damn shadow," James muttered. The dog's ears perked. James blinked. "Shadow, huh?" The name settled into the air like it had always belonged. Shadow gave a slow blink, as if accepting it. James huffed a laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, guess that suits you." For the first time in years, James stepped outside, not for errands, not for work, but just to walk. Shadow trotted beside him, sniffing the air, ears alert. James kept his head down at first, ignoring the occasional glance from neighbors. He wasn't the type to make small talk, hadn't been for a long time, but then, "Morning, James?" He hesitated, glancing up. Old Mrs. Harper, standing by her garden fence, offered a polite nod. He nodded back. Word spread. The quiet man who had withdrawn from the world now walked the streets with a dog at his side. People noticed. James didn't know if he liked it. But Shadow? Shadow made it easier. The cabin was quiet, save for the ticking clock and the rustle of leaves outside. James pulled the blanket over himself, exhaling. Sleep had always been restless, fractured by old memories, by silence that felt too heavy. Then soft footsteps. James cracked one eye open. Shadow stood at the doorway, ears slightly flattened, hesitating. James stared. "Well, are you coming or not?" Shadow's tail gave the slightest twitch. Slowly, cautiously, the dog stepped forward. One step, another. Until he leaped onto the bed, curling up at the edge. A deep sigh, warm and content, filled the room. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so empty. For the first time in years, James wasn't alone. The evening air was crisp, the rhythmic sound of James's footsteps blending with the soft click of Shadow's claws against the pavement. The quiet street was bathed in the golden glow of streetlights, casting long, gentle shadows across the sidewalk. Then, Shadow stopped. Mid-step, his body tensed like a coiled spring, ears snapping forward, fur bristling in sharp ridges along his back. A low, guttural growl rumbled from his throat, something James had never heard before. Ahead, a car slowed, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The windows were tinted, the driver's face obscured. Something about it felt wrong. The car door creaked open and a man stepped out. His boots scraped against the pavement, his broad frame shadowed by the dim streetlights. His eyes locked onto Shadow with eerie familiarity. "There you are," he muttered, his voice rough like gravel. "Didn't think I'd find you out here, boy." James's grip on the leash tightened. "Excuse me?" The man ignored him, taking a slow step forward. "He's mine." James blinked. "What?" The man snapped his fingers. "Come on, Rex, time to go." But Shadow didn't move. Instead, his ears flattened against his skull, his tail tucked tight between his legs. James could feel the tremor running through Shadow's body. The dog stood rigid, frozen, his deep brown eyes darting between the man and James, a silent, desperate plea. Something was very wrong. James crouched slightly, placing a reassuring hand on Shadow's head. "You know this guy?" he murmured. Shadow didn't even glance at the man. His entire body language screamed fear, betrayal, something James couldn't quite place. But it was enough. The man took another step forward. "He's mine," he repeated, sharper now. "I don't know what you think you're doing with my dog, but hand over the leash." James didn't budge. "If he's yours, where's his paperwork? Any proof?" The man scoffed, stuffing his hands into his jacket pockets. "Don't need paperwork. He ran off a while back and has been looking for him ever since." James narrowed his eyes. "Where?" "Out west." James clenched his jaw. "Funny, because I rescued him from a shelter across the state." The man's expression flickered, just for a second. His tongue darted over his chapped lips, a sliver of frustration seeping through his confidence. James took a slow step back, pulling Shadow closer. "You're lying." The man's face darkened. Long after the encounter, James sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating the unease in his eyes. He couldn't shake the tension coiling in his chest. Something wasn't right. He typed quickly, searching local missing dog reports. His heart pounded as he scrolled, then stopped. A news article. A man recently released from prison, convicted of illegal dogfighting, suspected of stealing pets. James's pulse spiked. He clicked on the image and his breath caught in his throat. It was him. The same man, and Shadow. Shadow had once belonged to that nightmare. The knock came early the next morning, loud, angry. James's stomach dropped. He didn't need to look. He already knew who it was. He opened the door just enough to see the man's face. His eyes were darker now, his jaw clenched tight. "You think you're smart?" he hissed. "You think you can just keep him?" James's grip on the door tightened. "He's not yours. He is mine." The man's voice dropped lower, laced with venom. "And you're making a mistake." James's other hand hovered over his phone, ready to call the police. "I'm not giving him up." A deep, warning growl broke the tension. Shadow stepped in front of James, body rigid, eyes locked onto the man like a shield forged in fury. The man hesitated. "Oh, now you want to act tough?" he sneered. Shadow bared his teeth. His growl deepened into something primal, something dangerous. The man's confidence wavered. He glanced between Shadow and James, his expression twisting into something unreadable. "This isn't over," he muttered, stepping back. "You'll regret this." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. James exhaled, his hand shaking as he ran it over Shadow's fur. "Good boy." As the car's tail lights disappeared down the street, James's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't over. He pulled Shadow close, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "We need to act fast," he whispered. Shadow let out a soft whine, leaning into him. James knew he had to protect him. No matter what, James doesn't waste a second. He picks up his phone, his hand steady but his heart racing, and dials the authorities. He recounts every encounter, the man's threatening presence, Shadow's terrified reaction, the attempt to take him by force. "This isn't just a stolen pet case," James insists, his voice firm. "Something deeper is going on." He provides descriptions, the car's license plate, every chilling detail. As he hangs up, a cold realization settles in. If this man isn't stopped, more animals could suffer. Later that night, James kneels beside Shadow, running his fingers gently through his thick fur. That's when he notices them. Thin, jagged scars hidden beneath the softness. Some old, some newer. A lump forms in his throat. "Oh, buddy, what did they do to you?" he whispers. Shadow presses his head against James's chest, seeking comfort. James tightens his arms around him. No matter what it takes, he'll never let Shadow suffer again. James isn't taking any chances. He installs security cameras, double-checks the locks, and keeps Shadow by his side at all times. Every unfamiliar car that passes sends a ripple of tension through him. Late at night, he lies awake, ears tuned to every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows. He won't let his guard down. If that man comes back, James will be ready. Days pass without incident, until one night Shadow stiffens. A low growl rumbles from his throat as he stares at the window. James follows his gaze, his pulse spiking. A figure moves just beyond the porch, lurking in the darkness. Adrenaline floods his veins. He grabs his phone, flipping on the porch light in one swift motion, but the figure is already retreating, swallowed by the night. James tightens his grip on the phone. Enough is enough. The next morning, James contacts the police again. This time, they don't just listen, they act. Hours later, an officer calls back. "You were right, the guy's wanted for illegal activities." James exhales sharply. He already knows. He's seen the cruelty in the man's eyes. "He's been running a dog-fighting ring," the officer adds grimly. "We believe Shadow was one of his victims." James's stomach churns, but then relief washes over him. It's finally over. The arrest makes the local news. A notorious animal abuser taken down. James watches the coverage, one hand resting on Shadow's back. The dog is safe now. Truly safe. That afternoon, James signs the final adoption papers, officially making Shadow his. "You're home for good, buddy," he murmurs. Shadow wags his tail, nuzzling James's hand. For the first time, his eyes don't hold a trace of fear, only trust. That night, James sits by the fireplace, Shadow curled up beside him. The dog lets out a content sigh, his body completely at ease. James watches him, feeling something shift deep inside. He thought he was rescuing Shadow, but the truth is, Shadow saved him too. As the fire crackles, James smiles, resting a hand on Shadow's head. "Welcome home, buddy," he whispers. And for the first time, Shadow knows he truly belongs. James never imagined that pulling over for a frightened, abandoned dog would change everything. But as he watched Shadow sleeping peacefully beside him, he understood. A single act of kindness had rewritten both their destinies, proving that even the smallest compassion can ripple into something life-changing. At first, James believed he was the rescuer, but as the days passed, he realized the truth. Shadow had saved him too. The dog's trust, once shattered, had been rebuilt, and in doing so it had mended something broken within James as well. Shadow's unwavering devotion wasn't instant, it was earned, piece by piece, through patience and love. What was once a fearful, hesitant creature had become James's most loyal companion, proving that true bonds are built on trust, not force. James knew saving Shadow wasn't just about one dog. It was about standing against cruelty. He had given Shadow a voice, and in doing so he had found his own. Doing what's right wasn't easy, but it was always worth it.